Afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Nolene Duff and I'm the Chair of Administrators here at the City of Casey, and it's my pleasure this afternoon to welcome my colleague administrators, Mr Miguel Belmar. Good afternoon. And Mr Cameron Boardman.
Good afternoon, thank you.
And our Chief Executive Officer, Mr Glenn Patterson. We're assisted this afternoon by Jacinta McLeod and Jordan Barfoot on our technical side. We are live streaming, obviously, this afternoon, and only live streaming. The meeting is being held virtually and held in accordance with the requirements of the Victorian Government re public gatherings. I start with the statement of acknowledgement. The City of Casey proudly acknowledges the traditional owners of the land, Casey's Aboriginal communities, and their rich culture, and pays respect to their elders past, present and future. We acknowledge Aboriginal people as Australia's first peoples and as the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we work and live. The diversity statement. The City of Casey is home to remarkable diversity of cultures, languages, faiths, identities, landscapes and stories. From our first Australians to our most recent arrivals and every wave between, the City of Casey welcomes and represents all community members and their respective ambitions to live healthy, rewarding and happy lives. These intersecting and overlapping community stories from Casey's collective identity and contribute to its evolving rich history. We recognise this diversity as our strength and we aim to share, nurture and celebrate it. I move to item 2 of the agenda, the confirmation of minutes of the meeting held on the 21st of July 2020. Do I have a mover for those minutes, please?
I'm happy to move those.
Mr Belmar moved, seconded?
Yes, I'll second those, Chair.
Seconded, Mr Boardman. All in favour? Carried unanimously. Item 3, declaration of interests. I've considered my obligations under section 79 of the Local Government Act 1989 and have no interests to declare relevant to items on tonight's agenda. I also note that no officers have declared any interests. Do my fellow administrators have any interests to declare? Mr Belmar?
No, I do not.
Mr Boardman?
No, I have no interest.
Thank you. Public question time. I note there are no public questions received for this afternoon's meeting, but there is a question raised separately regarding item 5.2, and I'll treat with that question when we move to that item. So I now move to item 5, officer reports. There are 5 officer reports tonight. And the first report is item 5.1, payments for public open space equalisation under clause 53.01 of the Casey Planning Scheme. Do I have a mover for the recommendation?
Yes, I'll move that, Chair.
Thank you, Mr Boardman. Seconder? Mr Belmar. Mr Boardman, would you invite you to speak to the report?
It is a very straightforward and procedural report. As many listeners would understand, that the Casey Planning Scheme does require development sites to provide contributions commensurate with public open space. This is also a legislative requirement and it's relevant to the precinct structure plan, which is been advertised and is consistent with many of these large-scale developments. There are 2 such precinct structure plans which are due for contributions now, considering the completion of those developments, being the Cranbourne West and the Casey Fields South, and both the development contributions are due. There has been significant consultation insofar as not only the engagement for the development proposals themselves, but also what the financial obligations and the proposal for collecting and utilising equalisation payments. We had a greater discussion when we adopted the budget around forecast income and use of expenditure associated with such payments. But as I said, Chair, is a very procedural resolution and report, and with those very brief remarks, I will move it.
Thank you, Mr Boardman. Mr Belmar.
I second the motion. As Mr Boardman has alluded to, this is in part a procedural motion, but it also shows that Council has carefully planned in the past for future expenditure, and in the spirit of that, continuing proper management of funds, I second the motion.
Thank you. I'll put the motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried unanimously. Item 5.2, 13 to 15 Hazeldean Court, Berwick. And there is a question, and it's been submitted by Mr. Hubert Schreur. And Mr. Schreur has asked two questions. The first is, have the commissioners personally visited and inspected the site in question? And I'm happy to respond to that, and I have consulted with both Mr. Belmar and Mr. Cameron with respect to the question. None of us have visited the site, and that is in line with the restrictions placed upon us through the Victorian Government during the COVID-19 period. But to assure Mr. Schreur that we have, all of us, and I've had this discussion and confirmed this with both Mr. Belmar and Mr. Boardman today, all of us have reviewed the previous VCAT decision that was November 2018. That decision was the approval by VCAT of dwellings in accordance with that decision. We are aware that the subject land under the Casey planning scheme is identified for incremental change, and that's consistent with the council's adopted housing strategy. And we are aware that Mr. Schreur was party to those proceedings at VCAT. But the three of us believe we do have sufficient information on the basis of both that history, the reading of the detailed officer report, and as well as a review of the aerial images of the site that we've had access to. We do believe we have sufficient information to make an informed decision this afternoon. There's a further question, and this is the question. Council has for some years been developing a planning policy to complement, qualify and constrain the general residential zone. And so far, all that's come to this are a number of documents, guidelines, proposals, which unfortunately do not have the force of policy, but are all we had to rely on in formulating our objections. So this is the question. We believe the area of Old Berwick particularly requires formal neighbourhood character and vegetation policies and overlays. Had these been in place, we would not now be faced with these soul-destroyingly dense developments in our court. When is Council planning to complete this necessary development of planning policy for our area and for other areas of Casey? And I have been informed by the Manager of Planning and Building and the Head of Statutory Planning and Compliance that a neighbourhood character assessment for Berwick was prepared to inform the preparation of Council's housing strategy and was implemented through the approval of Planning Scheme Amendment C198 by the Minister for Planning in November of 2019. The General Residential Zone GRZ Schedule 1 was applied as the most suitable zone for this location. The planning assessment of the current application and neighbourhood character has considered the purpose of the GRZ and supporting planning policies which encourage housing density in this location, given its proximity to the Berwick Major Activity Centre. So I'll now move to the officer report and recommendation for item 5.2, 13 to 15 Hazeldean Court, Berwick, and I seek a mover. Mr. Belmar, seconder.
Seconded, Chair.
Mr. Boardman. Mr. Belmar, I invite you to speak to the recommendation.
Thank you, Chair. Now, in assessing and considering this application, I've had careful review of the officer's report, and the officer's report, I think, fairly sets out what are the key issues in this consideration. They are, firstly, whether the amended proposal is responsive to the neighbourhood character. Secondly, the impact on the existing peppercorn tree. And thirdly, consistency with the conclusions of a previous VCAT decision. If I can start with that last point first, this is not the first time that this site has been the subject of an application. In fact, it was subject of a VCAT decision in 2018, which dealt with essentially very similar, if not the same issues, and in that case decided to allow the proposal, but to remove one dwelling. what this application does, what this amended proposal does, is to bring back that dwelling, and it does it in a way that addresses the concerns raised in the previous VCAT decision. And I support the application because it is a carefully considered application that takes into account the Casey planning scheme. It responds appropriately to the planning scheme and does something that is, from my point of view, an important part of the Casey planning scheme, and that is that it recognises the incremental change that is allowed in this zone. And by that I mean this is a change which is responsive to the zone. It's introducing one more dwelling to an already permitted use, and for those reasons I think it's an appropriate application and one that Council should support.
Thank you, Mr. Belmont. Mr. Boardman.
Thank you, Chair. I acknowledge and agree with my colleague, Mr. Belmar's statements around the thoroughness of this process. I just want to make one point, if I could, Chair, in relation to one of the public questions that were raised around whether or not any of us had visited the site, despite the current restrictions that are placed upon us by the state government. I think we do need to acknowledge what our actual roles are, and not to be seen to be unnecessarily influencing any statutory planning processes or council processes in any way. Frankly, I don't know what myself personally visiting this site would have added to the process whatsoever, particularly after the process has been through not just thorough consideration against the planning overlays and the scheme internally, but also as a consequence of the VCAT decision. It would have been highly inappropriate under that scenario for me to in any way be an interventionist and to potentially give a personal opinion. I am not a licensed surveyor. I am not a builder or a developer or someone that is qualified in planning, but I am someone who is qualified in governance and process and decision making based upon evidence and facts. And I think we need to be very conscious as administrators not to be seen to be overtly influencing or giving preferential attention or access to any planning application over any other. As soon as we create that precedent, the genie is out of the bottle and we'd probably be finding ourselves doing nothing else but. So whilst I respect the intention and the sentiment provided by members of the community that have requested such a visitation, it is not appropriate for us to do so, and certainly if further invitations were expressed, they would certainly be considered on a case-by-case basis, but the overarching precedent on what our role and obligation responsibilities are vis-a-vis what the council officers' roles and responsibilities are will be foremost in our decision making.
Thank you, Mr. Boardman. And I'd just like to make a few comments as well with respect to this application. I concur with the specific comments made by Mr. Belmar in terms of both the context of this site and the strategic work that's been undertaken as a precursor to the zoning that sits around this site. I think the assessment has been concluded quite comprehensively both by officers and subsequent to that by VCAT, and this application is quite narrow in the amendments and changes that are being made. So I too concur with the recommendation. So I'll put the motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried unanimously. Thank you. Now item 5.3, the lease of Wilson Botanic Park Berwick Cafe, and there is a recommendation. Do I have a mover?
I will move that, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Boardman. A seconder?
I'll second that.
Mr. Belmar. Mr. Boardman, would you like to speak to the matter?
Some very brief comments, Chair. This was a matter that we resolved at a meeting in June against community demand or an identified need for hospitality facilities at the Wilson Botanic Park in Berwick. We gave approval for council to enter into a process to seek a lessee, and following that, a lessee has successfully been applied, and we do congratulate Berwick Cafe and Co Proprietary Limited for being successful in receiving or potentially subject to us formally endorsing this tonight, a 20-year lease, and we authorise the Chief Executive Officer to enter into that lease. We're quite certain that once restrictions are lifted, that this will turn into be a significant asset to visitors to Wilson Botanic Park, and that the cafe itself will be a successful business. It is unfortunate that we do find ourselves in the situation where all hospitality venues across the municipality and across the state have had to revert back to takeaway only, but it does give time for such facilities to potentially take stock of their business and to look at ongoing public demand and to pivot their businesses accordingly. But equally, if we all are disciplined and comply by the restrictions, and we ensure that we can come out of this lockdown as quickly as possible and return to normalcy, hospitality business such as Wilson Botanic Park will thrive. Pent-up demand will be a great motivator, and I look forward to visiting myself in due course.
Thank you, Mr. Boardman. Mr. Belmar, any further comments?
I heartily support the motion for the reasons that I also did on the last occasion. I think it's appropriate that a service like this be available so that the community can stay at the one location and access the services of this nature. And I support the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Belmar. And the report does confirm that Council has met its obligations under the Local Government Act. So I'll put that motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried unanimously. Item 5.4, the telecommunication lease for the NBN at 46 Browns Road, Devon, Meadows. You can see the recommendation there, and do I have a mover for that recommendation?
Yes, I'll move that.
Thank you, Mr. Belmar. A seconder? Mr. Boardman. Yes. Thank you, Mr. Belmar. I invite you to speak.
Yes, this is a motion for the use of a lease by which a monopole in a council facility will be leased to the NBN so that they can attach assets to it. It's for a term of 20 years. I support the motion. It's proper use of council's discretion to undertake this sort of activity. The NBN is here. It's here to stay, and we need to ensure that it's up to date and properly located for use by the coastal community. And I support the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Belmar. Mr. Boardman.
Thank you, Chair. There's nothing really further to add except that the NBN has brought forward a number of their rollout scheduling. They are being, understandably in the current environment, much more forthright on trying to ensure their infrastructure is ahead of their rollout timetable. And infrastructure such as this is going to become more commonplace in our municipality and arguably state and nationwide for the reasons that digital connectivity and digital conferencing such as what we are doing at this moment are going to be here for the long haul, unfortunately or otherwise. But nonetheless, this type of infrastructure is, as I said, going to be very commonplace and is necessary in the current operating environment. For that reason, it must be supported.
Thank you very much. I'll put the motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried. Conservation Advisory Committee meeting held in June 2020. Do I have a mover to accept those minutes?
Yes, I'll move and accept those minutes.
Mr. Boardman, and seconder?
I'll second that.
Belmar, would you like to say anything, Mr. Boardman?
I'll just briefly acknowledge the Conservation Advisory Committee and thank them for their work and contribution to Council's activities, noting that there are two key items were discussed at this particular meeting, being the update on the proposed AGL and APA gas import jetting pipeline project in Western Port and the Sustainable Marine Waste Development update. They are two very key issues that ourselves as administrator and the council as a whole are considering, and we will be making further statements on those particular matters in the future, and that the feedback and the minutes and the notes from the Conservation Advisory Committee has been referenced and will certainly be further considered as we further deliberate those particular issues. So I thank all members of the committee for their contribution.
Thank you, Mr. Boardman. Anything further, Mr Belmar?
Likewise, I'd like to thank each member of the committee for their time in ensuring that the interests of the community are represented on this important issue. And like Mr Boardman, I can reflect on the fact that the matters that they are considering at their meetings are precisely the ones that are a concern to us as administrators, and it is very useful to have their input.
Thank you. I'll put the motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried. Now move on to item 6, consideration of reports of committees, and I note the record of discussion as listed in the agenda papers. Item 7, petitions. We do have one petition which has 556 signatures. 149 of those signatures are from residents within Casey, and it is with respect to the development of a dirt BMX track in Botanic Ridge. I do note with advice from officers that this site is a reserve that is owned and managed by council, and there's no oversight of the facility that includes unauthorised BMX jumps. Nevertheless, I shall note a recommendation that the relevant department, City and Asset Planning, write to the head signatory and provide a response to the matters raised in the petition. Do I have a mover for that recommendation?
I'm happy to move that.
Thank you, Mr Belmar. Seconder?
Seconded.
Mr Boardman. Mr Belmar, would you like to speak to the recommendation?
Very briefly, it's interesting that we've had a petition that includes the community from places far and wide, and that the City of Casey is of interest. But at the same time, it just shows that there's facilities that may be required, and that council will appropriately respond to petitions by ensuring that the work is done to respond.
Thank you, Mr Belmar. Mr Boardman, anything to add?
Just to note very quickly that I would suspect the date of signatures on the petitions would have predated the imposition of stage 4 restrictions. So the use of recreational facilities, as we know, have been suspended for 6 weeks, and it does give us time to fully prepare an adequate response.
Thank you, Mr Boardman. So I put that recommendation to the vote. All in favour? Carried. Urgent business, item 8. There are no items of urgent business for this afternoon's council meeting, and that leaves me with one duty, and that is to declare the meeting closed and to thank those members of the public who have joined us on the live stream this evening. Thank you very much.